We are back, and we are joined now by Timothy M. Gill, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, author of Encountering U.S. Empire in Socialist Venezuela, The Legacy of Race, Neocolonialism, and Democracy Promotion. Tim, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So it's a good day to have you on because today we got some, hopefully pretty good news, more normalized relations with Venezuela. The U.S. and Venezuela have agreed on a prisoner swap. The U.S. will release an ally of Maduro, and the U.S. gets back, I guess, 10 Americans who were jailed in Venezuela, including a defense contractor. But either way, obviously, this is how diplomacy works. This is how kind of making thawing some of these tensions plays out in practice. Before we get into your book, I just wanted to know what your reaction was to these recent developments between these two countries.
Yeah, I think it's very positive. I think under the Trump administration, they just took a hammer to everything. And although there were certainly serious problems with the Venezuelan economy, particularly corruption, and a lot of, siphoning money off and currency distortions and all the rest of it, the sanctions that the U.S. put on Venezuela really exacerbated very intensively an already difficult economic situation and rendered it really calamitous, that leading to shortages of medicine and food, all sorts of products. And, from their perspective, they thought that this was going to knock out Maduro, get rid of the socialists. It didn't. Sanctions often don't have that effect.
You cut out there, but just essentially, you were speaking about sanctions, Tim. If you want to continue that thought.
Yeah, I mean, I generally, I think it's a positive development. I mean, I think under Trump, there was really not much effort towards diplomacy and just trying to hammer Venezuela and possibly even some, moves to there was discussion of a military overthrow. There was support for Juan Guaido, who was, this kind of self-appointed leader of the country, and the population suffered. At the end of the day, it was Venezuelans that suffered as a result of U.S. foreign policy and sanctions. So I think, these are positive steps that the Biden administration is taking to try to normalize relations with the country, relax the sanctions, and have these goodwill gestures between the countries of these releases of prisoners. So I see it as a positive development. I'm happy to see it.
Yeah, and so much of your book focuses on the democracy promotion business of the United States, and that's how it's branded. And that manifests itself as like NGOs and funding political movements and parties in different countries, essentially that are sympathetic to the United States. And if people have been watching this program for a while, they're probably pretty familiar with that dynamic. But what I found so fascinating about your research is just when that transition from the very institutional and formal display of American might and power. I mean, the public was not aware of it in the way that it should have been, but in the fact that it was just CIA policy, right? When that transition started to happen from these CIA orchestrated explicit coups in places like Guatemala and other Latin American countries, when that shifted to the Venezuela model that we see today, that is hopefully kind of losing steam, the democracy promotion, influence peddling, what does that shift look like, and what are the identifiers for our audience to look for?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that, the democracy promotion, system, if you will, gets off the ground in the 80s and 90s. And the thinking in DC changes because there is this support for these authoritarian governments in places like Nicaragua, Cuba, and Iran, elsewhere. And what do you see happen? People don't like those governments. And in some instances, they overthrow them. And a government comes to power that is, anti-U.S., very critical of the U.S., doesn't fall in line behind the U.S., has different ideas concerning nationalism and nationalization of resources, and influenced by ideas like liberation theology, socialism, Marxism, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and Castro's in Cuba. And so people in DC begin to rethink the foreign policy approach. You know, if we're going to support dictatorships, authoritarian rulers, and then they get overthrown, you know, what's going to come next? And so they begin to think, well, maybe we should shift to supporting democracy, but particular type of democracy, right? When we can flood particular parties, NGOs, and social movements with a great deal of resources and training, and hopefully we can engineer civil society and politics abroad, so that parties come into power that are sympathetic to the U.S. or at least don't challenge the U.S. and so that's the kind of modality we see of U.S. foreign policy abroad these days. You know, certainly there are instances where the U.S. is supportive of authoritarian governments, some governments in Central Asia, Azerbaijan, others that were helpful in the war on terror. But generally in Latin America, at least, what we see is the U.S. working through these democracy promotion agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy, like the U.S. Agency for International Development, where they finance social movements, NGOs, political parties on the ground. And so what you'll often see is that, and it can be hard to uncover a lot of this evidence. You know, if you go to the NED's website or USAID's website, it's often very speaking in very general, abstract terms about promoting pluralism and democracy. But if you make requests, FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, you see and you drill down that they're financing particular parties, oftentimes center-right parties, and they're not just flooding them, you know, with cash, but they're trying to train them in how to build websites, how to speak to journalists, how to build political platforms, setting up forums so various political parties can get together and they're not splintering their vote. So it's a kind of a long-term effort to undermine government. So it's not, you know, supporting a Pinochet or a military to overthrow government, but sort of a long-term process of building up, you know, trying to build in terms of, if you think in terms of Antonio Gramsci, you know, building up civil society and trying to cultivate a new sort of hegemony, and eventually that these forces can take power in elections.
It is a real, in my estimation, bastardization of what democracy really entails, especially acutely, I would say, apparent in Venezuela, because I guess it was a few years ago at this point, at the outset of the Biden administration, he had this summit about democracy in the world and how important it is, kind of in an effort to distance himself from, you know, Trump and his attempt to overturn the election. And Guaido was invited, right? I mean, and that is just so, that symbolism of that, of, you know, the United States recognizing somebody as the leader of Venezuela, who is not the leader of Venezuela, but who is the sympathetic figure to U.S. interests there. That kind of says everything, right, about what U.S. and we just praise Biden for shifting away from some of the mistakes in Venezuela, and hopefully things are changing there. But that impulse and that kind of, you know, some of the assumptions that are just so baked into whoever's going to be in office about what democracy means and what it means to promote democracy abroad, that visual of Guaido there at the Democracy Summit just really encapsulated it for me.
Sure. Yeah. Now he's in the U.S. He's teaching a course down in Florida, and I don't know what students are going to learn. I'd like to see a syllabus, but yeah. I mean, even beyond Guaido, you know, and all over the continent, we can be sure that the NED, USAID are financing particular parties in Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And this isn't to say that, you know, Maduro and Ortega don't have issues with democracy, but it's clear that the U.S. is trying to use its financial and power and influence to engineer and bring about particular changes in countries that it would like to see. And you know, again, you know, in places like Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, you name it, not much concern with democracy. Might pay a little bit of lip service to it, but it's all certainly dwarfed by all the other assistants, and these countries know that. But yeah, I mean, from Guaido and elsewhere, there's a certain type of democracy and particular democratic actors that are promoted and financed by the U.S.
So let's go back a little bit, I guess, and I wanted to just ask you if you could kind of summarize when America set its sights on Venezuela and why they did.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Venezuela has always been, since the discovery of oil, has been a country of interest, and that's what makes it important at a global level. Before the discovery of oil, a lot of the exports were chocolate and fruit and things like this. And, for a long period of time, actually during the mid-20th century, when you did see folks like Pinochet and other dictators throughout, the Southern Cone and elsewhere, Venezuela was thought to be kind of this example of a two-party system, and it was seen as a kind of a boring place from the perspective of journalists and academics, and there was kind of two parties going back and forth. But there was a lot of inequality, and it came to a head. There was some protests and rioting in the 1980s, and this kind of changed the political cultural landscape. And when Chavez comes to power and he's elected and comes to office in the late 90s under Clinton, there were efforts by him to be friendly with the U.S. government. He traveled to the U.S. Believe it or not, it's kind of it's surreal to think about, but he actually threw the first pitch out at a New York Mets game in New York City. Went to New York Stock Exchange. He met with business leaders and tried to be friendly with the U.S. Now, in the wake of the global war on terror and just the evolution of Chavez's thought, he did not go along with the war, the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. And that was really, I think, you could talk about, the U.S. just wants the oil in Venezuela. I mean, the irony of the Bolivarian Revolution and Venezuela under Chavez, the oil always flowed, until Trump put the sanctions on. And so a lot of the financing of, the missions and the projects that Chavez was financing, the U.S. was its number one trading partner, right across the Gulf there. And so it wasn't that the U.S. wanted oil, but I think, my interpretation is that since the global war on terror and the fact that Chavez would not go along with it, that's when the U.S. set its sights on the country and really became more aggressive in its approach to try to get Chavez out of office. Then there was the coup in 2002. I don't think we have found a smoking gun that the U.S. was kind of masterminding or orchestrating. But, in the wake of the coup that took place that deposed Chavez for a few days, the U.S. was the only country in the hemisphere to recognize the legitimacy of this interim coup government. And so, I think that since the global war on terror, the U.S. and Chavez's rejection of U.S. foreign policy and how vociferous he was on his television shows and how outspoken he was against U.S. hegemony, neoliberalism, capitalism, that people in the U.S. government saw him as a foe, and that they should flood the opposition with a host of resources to try to get him out of office.
And do you place that basically at the feet of the Bush administration in that way of ramping this up to the fever pitch that it reached?
Yes, yeah, without a doubt. And I think that continued through Obama. I mean, you have a lot of people that, obviously, you might change some ambassadors, but you have a lot of the same people working in the State Department, and USAID and NED. And so that was something in my research I was always trying to tease out, whether there was any sort of differences between the Bush administration or Obama. And, oftentimes people would say. And if you look at the documents, many of the same groups were being financed, many of the same parties they were working with. There really wasn't all that much change, to be honest. And Bush kind of set that in motion, and it's largely continued into the present. You know, the U.S. has a very long history of relations with particular groups now in the country, political parties, civil society groups that do things like, libertarian think tanks and all this type of thing, financing radio shows, a whole battery of activities that they do, from financing rock bands was something that got some
I saw that, yeah.
Right. And so, they have these long-term things, long-term groups, and then they have, some kind of spotty things they do as well, financing festivals and what have you. But all in an effort, to incrementally build up these forces to get rid of Chavez and his allies, Maduro now, of course.
Yeah, the level of U.S. tentacles in Venezuela reminds me of Haiti to another extent. Like, that's also Haiti has been targeted by American NGOs in a battle for their resources, in my opinion, for decades. And the Clinton, I mean, it was bipartisan. But in terms of Venezuela, like, how much of this is central to the politics of regular Venezuelans? Like, how central is opposition to U.S. meddling to like their political consciousness in their support of Chavez and now Maduro?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is something that Chavez and Maduro have used to drum up nationalism within the country. I mean, when I would do research in the country, I would go to saw Chavez speak on some occasions, and also saw the opposition, Enrique Capriles. There was an election there, and a lot. I mean, Chavez and Maduro, they're not going to do a speech without talking about, the empire and imperialism and attempts to undermine the government. I mean, I think that's a critical part of the consciousness of the government and of people that support the government. I mean, I think that some folks are also critical and we're critical of Chavez and Maduro and trying to lay blame on everything that's going on at the feet of the U.S. And the U.S. was also conscious of that too. They didn't want to say too much because they know that, Chavez and Maduro could use that in their speeches for fodder or otherwise. And,
well, that's what the sanctions are for, right? Like, it's to in theory, it's collective punishment, but it's all, but for their purposes, it's so they turn on their government. But like, there's so many racist implications in that. I mean, you write about this as well, that the Venezuelan people would be just like too dumb to figure it out, that the United States is trying to put their whole damn hand on the scale.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing about these programs. At the end of the day, you think about it, and the U.S. was doing really wild things, like creating schools deliberately for poor Venezuelans to provide them with ideological ammunition to fight back against socialism, and in putting them in courses, lauding the free market and all the rest of it, And they would say in interviews with people from USAID, from NED, from these groups that were on the ground that, that people were manipulated by Chavez. They didn't know any better. And so it was in the U.S. interest to go down there to show them what their true interests are. And that's why I bring in this idea of neocolonialism. We oftentimes talk about neocolonialism in terms of resources and corporations, but a key element of colonialism was the instruction of the native, right? That they didn't know any better. And I think there's a lot of resonance in these programs that goes back to that. That goes back to that period of colonialism, of the natives not knowing what their true interests are, and we need to instruct them. And if they only knew better, then they would vote for the person that we want in office, right? Because that's what it's all about. It's trying to convince them, yeah, you think that Chavez is a good guy, but he's actually not. And people would say this. They would. There was programs, for instance, in poor barrios in Caracas, where people from USAID and Washington were writing up documents, and they would create these fake community organizations, right, that were about participation in democracy, things that Chavez was talking about, to make it seem like this was a government program. And then they'd invite people from the community, and they'd have food and incentives to go. But people were writing from USAID in DC, trying to subtly, tear people away from Chavez and put them in touch with the opposition. And it didn't work, but they would do all sorts of things like this, hip hop concerts in poor neighborhoods, and these bands and murals, and all these efforts to try to convince Venezuelans that not to support Chavez, not to support socialism, that's not what, that's not the good life, and this is not a good person. And so, I think there's just so much resonance there to early periods of colonialism,
Absolutely. And again, the what we're seeing in Gaza right now is a great reminder that the colonial project of empire is it's ongoing. We've sanitized what it means, but now it's being live streamed, and it's, I think, difficult for people to compartmentalize it. So, Timothy Gill, the book is called "Encountering U.S. Empire in Socialist Venezuela: The Legacy of Race, Neocolonialism, and Democracy Promotion." We will put a link to the book in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Emma.